Story Part 1. I accepted a $75 per hour job as a night watchman. The shadows were watching me. The job posting was too good to be true. $75 an hour to sit in an old, abandoned warehouse from midnight to 6 a.m. No experience required, just a willingness to stay awake and alert. The ad said it was for security monitoring, but there were no cameras, no alarms, just a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. I needed the money, and the hours fit perfectly with my schedule. What could go wrong? The first night was uneventful. The warehouse was silent, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of rust. I sat in a small office near the entrance, the only light coming from my flashlight and the pale glow of the moon through the cracked windows. The shadows were long and deep, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching out to grab me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as the nights went on, I started to notice things. The shadows didn't just stay still, they moved. It was on the third night that I first saw it. I was making my rounds, shining the flashlight down the long, narrow aisles of the warehouse. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating stacks of old crates and machinery covered in tarps. Everything was quiet, just the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. I turned, my heart pounding, and pointed the flashlight toward the movement. There was nothing there, just a shadow on the wall. But it wasn't like the others. It was darker, thicker, and it seemed to pulse slightly, as if it had a life of its own. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to follow me, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. I tried to focus on my job, checking the locks on the doors and making sure everything was secure, but the unease grew with every step. By the fourth night, I was on edge. The shadows were more active, more aggressive. They seemed to cluster in the corners of the room, forming shapes that almost looked human. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Every time I turned my back, I felt a cold breath on my neck, a whisper in my ear that I couldn't quite make out. I started to carry the walkie-talkie with me at all times, my finger hovering over the call button, but I never pressed it. What would I say? That I was scared of the dark? On the fifth night, things took a turn for the worse. I was in the middle of my rounds when I heard a noise, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the wall, sliding across the floor toward me. It was shaped like a man, but its features were blurred, indistinct. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, and as it got closer, I could see that its eyes, if you could call them that, were glowing a faint, sickly yellow. I backed away, my heart racing, but the shadow followed. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy grip on my arm. I screamed and swung the flashlight, but it passed right through the shadow as if it were made of smoke. The grip tightened, pulling me toward the wall, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it was trying to drag me into the darkness. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the shadow was too strong. Just as I was about to be pulled into the wall, I heard a voice, a real, human voice, calling my name. I turned, and there was a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a stern face and a flashlight of his own. The shadow released me and retreated, melting back into the wall as if it had never been there. The man introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, the owner of the warehouse. He apologized for not being there to meet me earlier and explained that the warehouse had a history of strange occurrences. He said he had hired me to keep an eye on things, but he hadn't expected the shadows to be so active. I was too shaken to be angry. I asked him what the shadows were, but he just shook his head and said he didn't know. He told me to go home and get some rest, that he would take over for the rest of the night. I didn't argue. I grabbed my things and left, but as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching me, even in the light. The next day, I called Mr. Grayson to quit. I told him I couldn't handle the job, that the shadows were too much. He didn't try to convince me to stay. Instead, he thanked me for my time and said he would find someone else. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder who would take the job next, and if they would survive the shadows. Part 2. I accepted a $75 per hour job as a night watchman. The shadows were watching me. I thought I was done with the warehouse. I thought I could put the shadows behind me and move on with my life. But the truth is, the shadows never left me. They followed me home, lurking in the corners of my apartment, watching me from the darkness. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The shadows were real, and they weren't going to let me go. A week after I quit, I got a call from Mr. Grayson. He sounded desperate, his voice trembling as he begged me to come back. He said the new night watchman had disappeared, and he needed someone who knew what they were dealing with. He offered me double the pay, and despite my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself it was for the money, but the truth was, I needed to know what was really going on in that warehouse. The first night back was worse than I remembered. The shadows were everywhere, more active and aggressive than before. They moved like living things, slithering across the walls and floor, forming shapes that were almost human. I tried to stay calm, to focus on my job, but it was impossible. Every time I turned my back, I felt them closing in, their cold breath on my neck, their whispers in my ear. I decided to do some research. During the day, I visited the local library and dug through old newspapers and records, trying to find out more about the warehouse. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The warehouse had been built on the site of an old asylum, one that had been shut down after a series of mysterious deaths. The patients had claimed to see shadows moving in the walls, shadows that whispered to them, drove them to madness. The asylum had been demolished, but the land was cursed, and the shadows had never left. Armed with this knowledge, I went back to the warehouse that night, determined to confront the shadows. I brought a voice recorder, hoping to capture their whispers, and a camera, hoping to catch them on film. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew I was in over my head. The shadows were waiting for me, more menacing than ever. They surrounded me, their glowing eyes fixed on mine, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. I tried to stay calm, to focus on my plan, but the shadows were too much. They closed in, their cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me toward the wall. I fought back, swinging my flashlight and shouting for them to leave me alone, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, and I felt myself being dragged into the darkness. Just as I was about to be pulled into the wall, I heard a voice I recognized. It was Mr. Grayson, but he wasn't calling my name. He was chanting something in a language I didn't understand. The shadows hesitated, their grip on me loosening, and I took the opportunity to break free. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath. I never went back to the warehouse. I quit the job for good, and I moved to a new city, hoping to leave the shadows behind. But they never really left me. Even now, years later, I see them in the corners of my room, hear their whispers in the dark. I don't know what they want or why they chose me, but I know one thing for certain: the shadows are real, and they're always watching. This two-part story is designed to keep viewers on the edge of their seats, with a mix of psychological tension, eerie settings, and unexpected twists. The conclusion leaves room for interpretation, encouraging viewers to engage with the content and share their own theories about the shadows.